The villains in The Boys are different from most superhero villains. They don't live in giant secret bases. They don't sit in dark rooms planning world domination. They wear expensive suits, run corporations, give interviews, smile for cameras, and honestly, that's what makes them scary. Because the most dangerous people in The Boys usually don't look evil at first. They look successful, respected, powerful. The show understands something really important. Real evil rarely announces itself. It hides behind systems, money, politics, fame, and public image. That's why the villains in The Boys feel so believable. So today, we're breaking down every major villain in The Boys, what drives them, and why they work so well. Let's start with the center of the entire show, Homelander, because everything in The Boys revolves around him. And what makes Homelander terrifying isn't really the powers, it's the psychology. Homelander was raised in a lab by Vought. No parents, no normal childhood, no emotional stability. He was treated like a product before he was ever treated like a human being, and that completely destroyed him emotionally. That's the key to understanding Homelander. Underneath all the power, he's emotionally broken. He desperately wants love, validation, approval, connection. But he's also incapable of handling real emotional intimacy in a healthy way. That contradiction defines his entire character. And honestly, that's what makes him such a great villain. Not because he's evil in a cartoon way, because he feels psychologically real. Every season he gets worse. The public mask slips more. The violence becomes more open. The need for validation becomes more desperate. And by season 4, Homelander barely even pretends to care anymore. He's basically testing the world, seeing how much he can get away with. And the terrifying part? The world mostly lets him. That's what makes Homelander scary. Not just the power, the fact that people keep enabling him. Now let's talk about Madelyn Stillwell, because she's one of the most underrated villains in the entire show. Stillwell never had powers, but for years she controlled Homelander. That alone is insane. She understood him emotionally better than anybody else. She realized very early that Homelander was emotionally starved, so she weaponized affection. That's the important part. She never loved Homelander genuinely. She managed him, controlled him, manipulated him. She gave him just enough approval to keep him dependent on her emotionally. And because of that, she basically kept the most dangerous man on Earth under control for years. That's real power. Stillwell represents corporate evil in its purest form. She's not trying to destroy the world. She's trying to protect the company, protect the brand, protect the system, even if people die in the process. And honestly, that makes her feel disturbingly realistic. Now let's talk about Stormfront. Because Stormfront might be the smartest villain in the entire series, and definitely one of the scariest. Because Stormfront understands how modern extremism actually spreads. She doesn't walk around screaming her ideology publicly at first. She packages it carefully, as authenticity, as rebellion, as telling the truth. That's why she's so dangerous. She makes terrible ideas sound emotionally appealing. And the scary thing is, it works. Not just on the public, on Homelander too. Stormfront completely manipulates him emotionally. She figures out exactly what he wants. Understanding, emotional connection, validation, freedom from Vaught's control. And then she gives him all of it. Or at least she makes him think she does. Meanwhile, she's quietly steering him toward her own agenda the entire time. That relationship says everything about Homelander, honestly. The most powerful man on Earth can still be manipulated emotionally if someone understands his weaknesses. And Stormfront absolutely did. Now let's talk about Stan Edgar, because Edgar might actually be the most dangerous person in the entire show, and he almost never raises his voice. That's what makes him unsettling. Edgar understands systems, corporations, institutions, power structures. He doesn't control people through fear like Homelander. He controls them through leverage, planning, strategy. That's real-world power. And the fascinating thing about Edgar is that he doesn't even seem emotionally impressed by superheroes. To him, supes are products, assets, complicated business problems. Even Homelander, especially Homelander. That dynamic is incredibly important, because Edgar is one of the only people who talks to Homelander like he's not a god. And Homelander hates that. Edgar represents institutional evil, the kind that doesn't scream. The kind that quietly builds systems that hurt millions of people while protecting itself, legally and financially. Honestly, that's probably more realistic than any supervillain. Now let's talk about Victoria Neuman, because Neuman is one of the best long-term twists in the show. At first, she seems like an ally, a politician trying to expose Vought, someone fighting corruption, and for a while, the audience believes it. Then the show reveals who she really is, a secret soup with the ability to explode people's heads, and suddenly everything changes. What makes Neuman interesting is that she lives in two worlds at once. Publicly, she represents accountability. Privately, she's deeply connected to the same system she claims to oppose. That dual identity makes her dangerous, because Neuman understands politics just as well as Vought does. And unlike Homelander, she's patient, careful, strategic. She knows how to survive. That's why her scenes with Homelander are so interesting. Neither one fully trusts the other, but both understand they're useful to each other. It feels less like friendship, and more like two predators negotiating constantly. Now let's talk about Soldier Boy, because Soldier Boy is one of the most morally complicated villains in the show. He's not evil in the same way Homelander is. He's something different. Soldier Boy is basically the product of an older America, an older culture, one built around toxic masculinity, nationalism, violence, entitlement, and emotional repression. And the show does not soften him. He's racist, sexist, cruel, violent, but the show also explains how he became that way. He was betrayed, experimented on, tortured for decades. The trauma is real, but the important thing is this. The Boys never uses trauma to excuse him. It only explains him. That's a big difference, and honestly, that's one of the smartest things the show does consistently with its villains. It explains them without forgiving them. Now let's talk about the Deep, because the Deep is honestly one of the most pathetic villains on television. And that's exactly why he works. The Deep represents a very specific type of man. A guy who had status and power, used it terribly, and then spent years feeling sorry for himself instead of taking real accountability. That's basically his entire character. Every time he almost grows as a person, he falls right back into the same ego and entitlement. And honestly, that feels very realistic. The Deep isn't terrifying because he's powerful. He's terrifying because people exactly like him exist everywhere. Mediocre men given power they never deserved. Now let's talk about A-Train, because A-Train exists in this weird space between villain and redemption story. And that's what makes him interesting. His killing of Robin in episode 1 basically starts the entire series, and the show never lets you forget that. But over time, A-Train becomes more complicated. You start seeing the pressure he's under, the damage Vought caused, the desperation to stay relevant, the fear of becoming replaceable, and slowly, he starts realizing how much harm he's caused. The interesting thing about A-Train is that the Boys treats redemption realistically. Doing one good thing doesn't erase years of terrible choices. And the show understands that. That's why his arc works emotionally. Now finally, let's talk about the real villain of the Boys, Vought International. Because honestly, every villain in the show is a product of Vought in some way. Homelander was literally created by them. Stillwell was shaped by the company culture. Stormfront was protected by them. The Deep was enabled by them. A-Train was exploited by them. Everything leads back to the system itself. And that's really the central message of the Boys. The real danger isn't just bad individuals. It's systems that reward bad behavior, protect powerful people, monetize corruption, and prioritize profit over human life. That's why The Boys feels bigger than just a superhero satire sometimes. Because underneath all the violence and dark humor, it's really a story about institutional power. About what happens when corporations become too powerful. When fame becomes more important than morality. When image matters more than truth. And honestly, that's what makes the villains in The Boys feel so believable, because most of them don't think they're villains, they think they're winning. So what do you think? Who's the best villain in The Boys? Homelander, Stormfront, Stan Edgar? Or someone else completely? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into The Boys, broken superheroes, and the psychology behind some of the best villains on television, subscribe to the channel. Because honestly, The Boys understands villains better than most superhero stories ever have.